So, lesson 10, the second of our last two chapters. We have two chapters left. Lesson 10 is I don't want to use the word high point, but it's like the end of a movie where, all the bad stuff's happening in the film, the most thrilling part of the film. Lesson 10 is like that for this course. And, a lot of the events in this chapter are more painful times for Japanese history because, Japan does some things that are very, very destructive, not only to itself, but to other nations in the world, especially in Asia, uh, and eventually to the United States and Europe as well. So it's not a happy time for Japan or really for the world. This is the most destructive period of world history, two world wars, and we're going to see Japan's role in both of them. Okay, and also other wars and other events that take place throughout the end of the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. So as we left off at the end of the Meiji period, the second half rather, by 1894, Japan is a fully westernized and modernized nation. Okay, when I say westernized and modernized, that means they follow Western traditions. Okay, generally speaking, although they retain of course, their language, their culture. People wear Western-style dress. There is the countries in the middle of the industrial revolution, lots of factories, lots of technology in terms of steamships, telegraph lines, railways, etc. And most importantly, a very powerful army and navy. Okay, the key of the Meiji government is to, as I said, enrich the country and strengthen the military, and that's just what they did in the first half of the Meiji period. So Japan felt that if they wanted to convince the West to view them as an equal nation, in other words, to reverse those unequal treaties we were talking about, which had not been reversed by 1894, the only way they could do this was by strengthening their military, their army, and their navy. So what's the best way to prove military strength? Okay, you can have a military parade and show that you have this many people in your army or whatever, but you should go to war. If you want to prove that you're a strong country, you go to war against another country that you know you can beat. And that's just what the Japanese did. Until 1894, the Chinese had great influence over the Kingdom of Korea. Korea was an independent nation, but there was a lot of heavy Chinese influence, lots of Chinese advisors, and they actually controlled Korea's foreign affairs. Right? They determined Korea's foreign policy, and they considered Korea to be a Chinese protectorate. What this means is Korea is an independent nation, but China will help with its defense if anything happens. And we saw that with the 7 Years' War when Hideyoshi invaded Korea. The Chinese were there to help as well. Okay. So the Japanese, under the pretense of Korean independence, they say, well, you know what? We think Korea should be independent from China. It's not fair that China has a voice in their affairs. Let's liberate Korea from Chinese influence and make them an independent country. Okay, this is a pretense. In reality, the Japanese wanted to be the ones to control the area, but they didn't say that. They made it seem like they were the good guys and they were trying to help Korea from, against the Chinese, although the Koreans really didn't have an issue with it. And so Japan declares war on China. Okay? And the reason they declare war on China is to say, you need to get out of Korea and let them be independent. And if you say no, we're going to attack you. And that's just what happened. So Japan went to war with China in 1894. And this is, at that time, China was ruled by its final dynasty, the Qing dynasty or the Manchu dynasty, which was in heavy, heavy decline after decades of encroachment by the European powers. And this is known as the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. And the war acted as a time for Japan to test out their new army and navy. It's like you get a new car and you want to test out the motor, you want to take it for a test run. This is what Japan did. They were trying to basically do a test run of their army and navy against the Chinese. The Chinese were not an easy enemy to defeat. They were very strong. They put up a lot of resistance. But as I mentioned, Qing dynasty China was going through a lot of problems at that time anyway, a lot of internal turmoil. And so it was very easy for the Japanese with their modern army and navy to defeat the Chinese in about every single battle of the war. And back home, you have lots of woodblock prints printed in the newspapers and basically propaganda. You can see the Japanese in the black, with their modern weapons and their modern uniforms, tall, and you could see, the Chinese in the blue in their old-fashioned uniforms uh, getting defeated by the Japanese. This is a classic example of military propaganda that you see that really starts now and goes all the way up to World War II. But you could see that this was what the Japanese people back home thought. Japan was bravely defeating the Chinese with their brand new modern military might. And of course, the Japanese won this war, and so a peace treaty is signed between the Japanese and the Chinese in 1895, known as the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Okay, this was signed in Japan. Shimonoseki is a city in the former Choshu province. What a surprise! Choshu takes the credit again. And the peace terms of this treaty, it's supposed to be a peace treaty compromise, but because the victor always determines the rules, the Chinese were completely humiliated by the terms of this very unfair peace deal. And you can even see in this woodblock print, you see the Chinese sitting down in their traditional clothes, and the Japanese are standing tall. The imagery is used like this especially by military governments or authoritarian governments, to show, to fool the people into thinking that, well, we did the right thing, even though it really wasn't. So what are the terms of this peace treaty? Well, there's a few. First of all, China has to pay a large sum of money to the Japanese for damages. Okay, even though the Japanese were the ones who invaded, but the Chinese had to pay a sum of money. China had to promise that they were no longer allowed to interfere in Korean foreign affairs or political affairs, which gives Japan a green light to do what they want in Korea, which we'll see soon. Okay, and finally, China has to hand over the island of Taiwan to the Japanese. Okay, so it's basically Taiwan becomes the first Japanese colony ever. Japan has now joined the West in adopting colonies. Okay, so remember I said if you can't beat them, join them. That's just what they did. If Japan felt that they were going to be colonized, the best way to prevent that from happening is by colonizing themselves, and that's what they did with Taiwan. So Taiwan becomes annexed to Japan, which means it becomes part of Japan. You can even see this old map where you see Taiwan right south of, do you see the island? In the south, that's Taiwan. So it was pictured as an island of Japan. All the cities were given Japanese names, and it was basically like an extension of the Japanese islands as Japan's first colony. Also, probably the most damaging of these terms was that China had to give up Port Arthur, which is a strategic port in China on the Liaotung Peninsula in northeastern part of China. This port was very, very important because whoever had control of Port Arthur, this very important shipping port, is basically in control of all of Northeast Asia. Okay? In other words, they control which ships can dock, which ships can leave. This is a very, very important port. And China used to control it because, well, it's in China. Japan says that you need to give Port Arthur to us because we're going to be the bosses of Northeast Asia. Okay? This is a humiliating document. It is very, very unfair, very, very one-sided. There's really nothing in it for China. But the Chinese have no choice because they lost. They have to sign this document. Okay? And this is one reason why the Qing dynasty of China is the last imperial dynasty, because many Chinese, especially young people who were going to the West and learning about foreign lands, they felt that the Qing dynasty should not have agreed and they should have done something more. But after this first Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese began to look down on China because they defeated them so easily. And it's a shame considering basically Japan got so many things from China for its entire history, from the beginning to the end. Everything new came in from China, and now China is being looked down upon. Instead, the Japanese are looking up at the West and this colonization and imperialism and these great things that they feel are more useful to them now than the Chinese. The public opinion for the war was very, very supportive because of propaganda. Okay, and so many Japanese felt that they were doing the right thing in liberating Korea from the Chinese and going against this old-fashioned country. And when Japan won, that was the end of it. Japan became very, very nationalistic, probably more so than ever before. People took a lot of pride in being, in the army and the navy. And so the military, and also through the military, the secret police, who clamps down on anti-government rhetoric, becomes a very, very special class because of this new power. If you're a little kid, your goal is to become a general because, well, that's, look how good, cool they are. Look what they did. Look how we won. So nationalism in Japan really strengthens after the First Sino-Japanese War. And one element of this that worked out in the Japanese's favor is that after the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, the Western powers reverse those unfair treaties and declare them null and void. Okay, in other words, Japan no longer has to pay an import tax. That concept of extraterritoriality, where if you commit murder in Japan, you can't be arrested by the Japanese police and face trial in Japan, that was done away with. Okay, in other words, what it had to take, even if they did all these westernizing reforms, the only thing it took for the Japanese to be recognized by the West as being an equal power is if they behaved the same way they did. Okay, so when they started behaving as an imperialist power and going to war against other countries and taking colonies, that's when the West said, okay, I think we can recognize you as one of our group now. So it took a war to reverse the unfair treaties. And so Japan jumps right into this imperialist thing, this imperialist game, and Japan joins Britain, France, Russia, other countries in carving China up into spheres of influence. Okay, and you could see a picture here of all the different countries who had, I don't want to use the term colonies, but they had little spheres of influence. What a sphere of influence is that country has exclusive economic privileges in those areas. They have essentially their police force can operate. It's essentially a colony without being called a colony. Okay, and the Western powers had been doing this in China for a while. Okay, that's why in the city of Shanghai you had things called concessions, where each country had a little district that they controlled, almost as a mini colony. And so the Japanese jump into this, and this is called actually in the 1890s the carving of the melon, where China is like a melon, and each country has a piece of the pie. And you can see this political cartoon from that era, where each country, Britain, Germany, Russia, France, you can even see the samurai at the right hand corner. The Japanese are carving up China, and the Chinese are protesting, but they can't do anything about it. So Japan is the only non-European country, the only non-Western country to join in this game of imperialism. And they're doing it in China, okay, and they like this idea of being one of the group and being an imperialist power. They like that. That being said, doesn't mean that just because the unfair treaties are reversed does not mean that the European powers are going to be happy with Japan controlling Port Arthur. Okay, keep in mind that Port Arthur is whoever controls Port Arthur is going to control Northeast Asia. Okay, and the Russians have a problem with this because Russia is also a power in Northeast Asia. Keep in mind they're in Siberia, right? And Russia does not want to compete with Japan for control of this area. Okay, and Russia's best friends at this time are France and Germany. And so they are all kind of a united front against the idea of Japan controlling Port Arthur. They don't think this is a good idea. So in 1896, 1 year later, France, Germany, and Russia enact something called the Triple Intervention. Okay? And this is basically like a cease and desist. It's an ultimatum to Japan where they are forced to where the Japanese are forced to hand over the Liaotung Peninsula, Port Arthur, to Russia. That way, Russia would be restored as the master of Northeast Asia. Japan is no longer the master if it doesn't control this area. Okay? And the Japanese are furious, okay, because they felt that, we are the ones who went to war against China. We're the ones who defeated them. Why can't we keep Port Arthur? We're the ones who won. You didn't help us fight. Why do we have to give it to you just because you're a European power? Why does a European power have to control Port Arthur and not an Asian power? Okay? So the Japanese people are very upset. And the public opinion really shifts against the West and Russia in the late 1890s and early 1900s. Okay, the Triple Intervention actually made the Japanese people united against the West, especially against Russia, because they felt that we're a powerful country. We won. Look how far we've come in the last 30 years. We have a colony now in Taiwan, and also we're a divine people. Our Emperor Meiji is a god. How can you do this to us? And so Japanese public opinion really becomes upset at Russia in the late 1890s because they felt it was unfair that they won the war, the Japanese won the war against China, yet they had to now give up this territory to Russia for no reason. Okay, so Russia has control of Port Arthur. While this is happening in the year 1900, the Chinese people finally rebel against imperialism in their country. Okay, And this is the common people. We're not talking about the government. The government is pretty much, think of the Tokugawa in the late 1860s. That's where the Qing dynasty was at in the early 1900s. They had no power. So the common people begin to rebel against European and also Japanese imperialism in their country. This is called the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, so they try to get the Europeans and the Japanese out of China and isolate China from foreign influence. So in order to deal with this Boxer Rebellion, all the European countries sent troops to China to put it down. And of course, the only Asian country to send troops to China during this time was Japan, because Japan is also a colonial power, right? It does have interests in China. So the Japanese sent their troops to China to protect Japanese interests. So it really shows that Japan now considers itself more as a European power. It associates more closely with European powers, even though you have all of this anti-Russian, anti-Western sentiment. Japan identifies more with the Western powers than to a fellow Asian country under attack, right? So Japan, yeah, they could have sent troops to help protect the Chinese against the Europeans, but they refused to because they considered themselves an imperialist power as well. So even though the Japanese, sent troops to China during this time to help the Europeans and defend their own interests, Russia refused to give Port Arthur back to Japan. Okay, and there was a lot of tension in the early 1900s between the Japanese and the Russians, and things eventually come to an head when in 1904, Japan secretly and without warning. Okay, and this was a big deal because you in European or international protocol, military protocol, you never declare war, you never attack another country without declaring war first. Well, the Japanese ignored this rule, and so without any warning, they attack the Russian Navy in the Far East. The Japanese Navy fires on the Russian Navy, who are not prepared, and attack the Russian Navy. And this begins the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Okay. It's the first time that Japan has gone to war by its own decision. Okay, it's not like the Russians attacked them. The Russians weren't doing anything. The Japanese, on their own, with their own decision, on their own accord, attack the Russian Navy. And because the Russian Navy was not prepared for this, the Japanese completely destroyed the Russian Navy, the Baltic Fleet of Tsar Peter the Great, which, of the 1700s. His great Russian Navy was destroyed by the Japanese in a couple of battles. And the war eventually shifted from sea to land because in 1905, the Japanese army invades Port Arthur, which was under the Russian control, and regains control of the entire Liaotung Peninsula. Okay? And the Russian troops are not prepared. They're not really putting their all into the war. And so Japan defeats Russia in 1905. This is a big deal because you've never had a Asian country, or Japan or any Asian country, defeating a European power in war in the modern era. It was the first time. Okay, and there was a treaty that was signed in the United States, the Treaty of Portsmouth, concluded peace between Russia and Japan. President Theodore Roosevelt was responsible for mediating the peace. You could see him standing between the Russian delegation and the Japanese delegation in the photo there. So according to this peace treaty, Russia has to give control of the Liaotung Peninsula and Port Arthur back to the Japanese, which is the whole reason why the Japanese started the war in the first place. So Port Arthur is given a Japanese name. It's renamed Ryojun by the Japanese, and many, many Japanese move there for business interests. And Japan is now the master of Northeast Asia because it controls this important peninsula in China. Okay? So Russia, Japan got it after the war with China. Russia took it back, and then now Japan beats Russia to take it back. Meanwhile, China is the one who loses everything because, it's the Chinese territory that's being fought over by two imperialist powers. So, it was the Russo-Japanese War, namely Russia's defeat in this war, is one important factor behind the Russian Revolution of 1917, which ended the Romanov dynasty and monarchy in Russia and replaced it with, communist Soviet system, the Soviet Union. And this is because, the Russian people were shocked. They were already upset with the Tsar, Nicholas II, because of social issues, and, the Russian monarchy was very backward at that time. And then losing the war to some unknown country in Asia, the Japanese, this was a huge insult to the Russian people who could not believe that a great country like Russia, who is 5, 6 times, I don't even know the figure, but much, much bigger than Japan, could be defeated by them in war was a catastrophe. And so this is one factor behind the Russian Revolution of 1917. As I mentioned, it was the first time in modern history that an Asian country had defeated a European country in war. Okay, and now the Western powers have no choice but to recognize Japan to be a world power. Okay, and also view the Japanese as their equals. So now, for the first time, the West, whether it's France, Germany, Britain, the U.S., they realize that we cannot just ignore Japan anymore. The fact that they've defeated a Western country, in other words, this won the respect of the Japanese in the eyes of the West. Okay, because they saw that, in just 40 years, Japan has gone from a feudal samurai society to being a major player on the international stage, and they've become a world power. The Russo-Japanese War turns Japan into a world power with an empire, just like France, Germany, Britain, Russia, etc. It's a big deal.